Howdy, and welcome to LeeReads, where I talk about the books I've been reading and enjoying lately. This is going to be my reading wrap-up from the month of January. I've been trying something new so far this year, which is I have been keeping an actual reading journal. One thing that I wanted to try to improve this year was to be not only a little bit more intentional in what I'm selecting to read, but to really not rush through it, because I always feel like there's so many things I want to read, but to really mull over what I'm reading and try to understand not only, hey, do I like it or not, but like, what was the author trying to say? So I'm hoping that if I take the moment to handwrite some thoughts about each book periodically as I'm reading it, they will settle with me a little bit more. And I did read some good things this month. The first thing was The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a science fiction classic following the story about this envoy who is part of this greater empire, and they send their envoys out to new planets who may be ready to be introduced to the idea of like, hey, there's this whole corporation of planets, and maybe it will be beneficial to you and to us if you join with us. So the envoy goes to kind of spread the news, and it's the story of this envoy's experience on this planet that they call winter because it's very, very cold. And it follows his interactions with two of the different nations on that planet, and specifically with someone that used to be like a high-ranking secretary in one of the nations. The story is about a lot of different things. One of those things is communication or miscommunication, how people from different cultures or even just two individuals can be trying to say something to one another, and the other person just completely miss the message, misinterpret it, and like how that impacts events. One of the really interesting ideas that the book explores on the planet Winter is that the people there don't have sexual dimorphism most of the time. There's this 28-day cycle. There is no particular gender description or trait ascribed to a person. It's just they enter a phase called Kemner, which is like the sexual period where they either become male or female with other people who are experiencing that at the same time. And if there is mating that happens and pregnancy that happens, then that mother would stay a female until the baby is born, and then at that point they would go back to... My computer fan just started spitting in my PC, and it sounded like the PC was trying to take off. But the really interesting part of this is that in that culture, there are no assumptions about who and what you should be and how you should behave put on you based on your gender. And it's something that the envoy really has to grapple with, because their life experience so far is more like ours, where one of the very first questions that you ask when someone is born is it a boy or a girl? And then that just puts on all this pressure and expectation of how you should behave like for the rest of your life. And on Winter, they don't have that. So I found that aspect very interesting as well. And then how these two characters are trying to achieve the same ends possibly, and the friendship that grows between them throughout this very harrowing experience. Like, the envoy goes through some dark things in the story, but for how sparsely it's written, it really has an impact. And it's like, as from a writer's perspective, it's like, how could I make my writing be so concise yet impactful? There it goes again. Next, I have an e-arc of Nkedia Okorafor's recent release, Death of the Author. This one was interesting because I didn't necessarily like the characters, and yet what she did with the narrative was really cool. So one of the main characters is a writer. She's really down on her luck, and things aren't going well in her life, and so she sits down and tries to write something totally new and different. She writes a book called Rusted Robots, which is a science fiction, and she doesn't normally write science fiction. It's a pretty complicated tale, which you do read in segments throughout the book, about sentient robots essentially, and then there's AIs that don't have bodies or forms, and then they're at war together. Becomes a massive hit and changes her life. The lines between her science fiction and her reality start to blur, because she is someone who is paralyzed and normally uses a wheelchair, but then as she gains notoriety and fame from this story about robots, she gets put in contact with all these people working on different technologies that interface with your body, perhaps to equip her with these mechanical legs so that she may walk again. The two stories weave back and forth together. I didn't really appreciate it until I finished it, because the main character is so standoffish and has a chip on her shoulder. The relationships that she has with her family and her loved ones, it's still like, it's all very jarring and grating. She's starting to grapple with like this fame and social media following and the pressure of the publishers expecting another book, and she's afraid that she's never going to be able to write a book as successful as that first one. So there's a lot going on here. I think it's worth reading, especially once I finished it. I was like, I kind of want to go back and reread it now from this new lens. But that said, I didn't really love being in the main character's head that much. Next, I read a couple of sequels. The first one I want to talk about is Jova's Angel, which is the second book after Archangel. One of the books that I really enjoyed last year and ranked high on my tournament ranking. This is a very interesting series to try to describe because it is fantasy based on settings in the Middle East, like archaic settings in the Middle East. In the story, the angels have the power to like change the weather and answer people's prayers through song. That's how they communicate with the god. But as you're reading, you get hints about maybe there is some technology in here that the characters don't understand. It's like that Arthur C. Clarke quote, which, to paraphrase, is something like, every sufficiently advanced technology seems like magic. You know the quote I'm talking about? That's what really hits home in book 2. So I don't want to say too much to spoil anything, but it follows a different set of characters about 150 years later that are starting to deal with those sorts of problems. Like, what is magic / the religion / blessings from the god, and what is technology, and how do they interface? And you learn a lot about why things are the way they are, and I found it very, very interesting. I liked these two characters that we're following in this story. They were more compelling to me than the characters in the first story, and I definitely want to finish this trilogy. But I wish I could tell you more about this particular book, but I'm afraid it would spoil way too much. Check out Archangel. It's different, and I highly recommend that one. I continued on in the world of Valdemar by Mercedes Lackey by reading The Oathbound. This is the first book in the Vows and Honor duology, following Tarma and Kethri, who are two characters that I met when I read By the Sword, but I met them much older, so I already had a sense of where they would wind up. But this is a series of stories about they become sworn partners, sisterhood kind of bond. They come from very different backgrounds, but when they meet, which you don't actually see in this story, they become bound together to try to reset the course of their lives, because Kethri ran away from a horrible, horrible marriage and has basically been on the run. And Tarma, her entire clan was massacred and she's the only one left. In order to start to rebuild this clan, they need to develop a name for themselves. And this is essentially the story of how they develop that name for themselves. I found myself a little bit confused as to the circumstances of how they met and became so closely connected. Apparently that is told in a collection of short stories that I have an audiobook, but it didn't come next in the publication order, which is why I didn't read it. There was enough context for me to figure it out and to learn about the intricacies of both of their situations as we went, and I enjoyed the challenges that they were overcoming and the overall through story. Like, something that they do earlier in the book really kind of comes back to bite them later, and so they're basically working through that issue the entire time. I don't think that I explained it very well because it is like a series of adventures over time, but I do think it was a great way to get to know these two characters. My plan for Valdemar is once I finish the Vows and Honor duology, I'm going to read the last Herald Mage trilogy. Okay, one new book and then 2 rereads. I read The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leong. This one is described as a wandering fortune teller finds an unexpected family in this warm and wonderful debut fantasy, perfect for readers of Travis Baldree and Sengu Mandana, which I do agree with. However, there was plot in this story, and there was character growth and some heartache. The story especially deals with a sense of belonging. The main character is from a nation bordering the nation she's currently in. That's where she was born, but left there as a child to come to to this nation and has never really felt like she fits in. People still view her as an outsider, even though a lot of those traditions she doesn't remember anymore, and she doesn't have anyone to speak the language with. So it deals a lot with belonging and people, when she's traveling from town to town, people kind of treating her like with the side eye or as an outsider. She stumbles upon several different people throughout her journey, and the found family aspect is kind of their adventure together as they're trying to achieve their goal. I would say, as far as a lot of the cozy fantasy that's been coming out lately, this one really hit the spot for me because there were stakes, there was plot, however, it wasn't super stressful. Like, you had faith that things are going to be okay. And last, I have 2 rereads. Both of these I reread by audiobook, and I was inspired to do this when I visited my parents and I finally watched Dune Part 2. And I realized as I was watching that even though I remembered a lot of the story, there was a lot of the nuance and the plans within plans that I had just forgotten. It's been since high school since I read Dune, so I decided it's about time I need to reread this book. I listened to a recent dramatized version and I really enjoyed it. I feel like there were plenty of aspects of Dune that I didn't appreciate when I read it as a teenager. Back then, I was like, oh, the Fremen are so cool. This adventure is really fun. It's a revenge story, which it is, but a lot of the kind of subtlety of what Paul is grappling with was lost on me, and the fact that there really is no like good guy in this story, it makes me want to pick up the second book at least and kind of see how I go with that. Back in the day, I read like I think up to book 4 or book 5, I don't really remember, but I always was interested in the Bene Gesserit and how they worked. I'm actually intrigued to go watch Dune Prophecies now and see how they're portrayed in that show. And the last was The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I listened to the version narrated by Andy Serkis, and he did a wonderful job. It was so nice to just sit down and listen to it. The Hobbit is a story about a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins who kind of gets dragged into this adventure by Gandalf the Wizard and a group of dwarves, and the dwarves are setting out to reclaim their birthright, this home that their ancestors were chased out of by this dragon who now hoards all of the gold. So they're going to reclaim this home at the Lonely Mountain and also the treasure within it. Bilbo is recruited as the thief because Gandalf thinks it would be good for him to have an adventure. Of course, we now know that even though this was written as a standalone, it basically launches the further story of The Lord of the Rings. And I'm really glad that I reread it. It had been far too long, and now I really need to do my Lord of the Rings reread. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you also had a great start to your reading 2025. And as always, don't forget to support your local library. Thanks.